The blade whistled through the air where Sarah Gonzalez's head had been moments before. She rolled sideways across the frozen ground, her breath coming in ragged clouds as Alexander Kelly's axe embedded itself in the wooden post behind her. The scarred Viking warrior turned slowly, his pale eyes finding hers across the courtyard, where a dozen of his kinsmen watched in stunned silence. "You should have stayed in your cage, thrall," Alexander said, his voice carrying the weight of winter itself. Blood trickled from the marsh across his forehead where Sarah had struck him with the iron poker. "Now you die like the rest." Sarah pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling from cold and exhaustion. The rough woolen dress they had given her hung in tatters, stained with mud and blood. Around her, the other captives lay motionless in the snow, their bodies already growing stiff. She was the last, the only one who had lasted through the brutal winter months in this God's forsaken settlement at the edge of the world. "I will not run," she whispered, though her voice carried clearly in the crystalline air. "I will not hide." Alexander's scarred face showed no emotion as he pulled his axe free from the wood. The weapon gleamed dully in the weak morning light, its edge still sharp despite months of use. He had killed 17 captives with that blade over the course of the winter. Warriors, farmers, merchants, even children. None had lasted more than a few months before the cold, the hunger, or the despair broke them completely. But Sarah Gonzalez had endured, through the endless nights when the temperature dropped so low that breath froze in the lungs, through the meager rations that left her constantly weak with hunger, through the taunts and abuse of the other Vikings who saw her as nothing more than a curiosity, a southern woman too stubborn to accept her fate. Now, as spring began to touch the edges of the northern wilderness, she stood alone in the courtyard where so many had died. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, no longer braided in the style of her homeland. Her olive skin had grown pale from months without proper sunlight, but her eyes burned with a fire that had only grown stronger through the long winter. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Alexander raised his axe again, but something made him pause. Perhaps it was the way Sarah held herself, no longer cowering, but standing tall despite her exhaustion. Perhaps it was the memory of how she had tended his wounds after the bear attack, when infection had nearly claimed his life, and she had been the only one willing to risk entering his dwelling. Or perhaps it was simply that he had grown tired of killing. "Why?" he asked, lowering the weapon slightly. "Why do you not beg for mercy like the others?" Sarah's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Because I have nothing left to lose," she said, "and because I have seen what you are beneath all that armor and anger." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Around the courtyard, the other Vikings shifted restlessly, waiting to see what their most feared warrior would do. Alexander Kelly was known throughout the northern settlements as a man without mercy, a killer who showed no emotion as he dispatched his enemies. The scars that covered his face and arms told the story of countless battles, each mark a testament to his survival in a world where weakness meant death. But Sarah had seen him in moments when he thought no one was watching. She had seen him feed scraps to the settlement's half-wild dogs when food was scarce. She had watched him sit alone by the fire long into the night, staring at something only he could see. And she had been there when the fever dreams took him, when he called out names in his sleep and wept for losses he would never acknowledge in daylight. The standoff stretched between them, predator and prey locked in a dance as old as time itself. But something had changed in the dynamic, some subtle shift that neither of them fully understood. Sarah was no longer simply waiting to die, and Alexander was no longer simply a killer following his nature. "You know nothing of what I am," Alexander said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know you dream of a woman with golden hair," Sarah replied quietly. "I know you wake screaming her name. I know you carry her memory like a wound that will never heal." The axe trembled in Alexander's grip. Around them, the other Vikings had gone completely still, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. No captive had ever spoken to Alexander Kelly with such boldness and lived. No thrall had ever dared to mention his private torments. "Her name was Ashley Thomas," Sarah continued, taking a step closer despite the weapon in his hands. "She was taken in a raid 3 summers ago. You loved her, but you could not save her." The sound that came from Alexander's throat was barely human. He lunged forward, the axe raised high above his head, ready to end this conversation and the woman who had dared to speak the unspeakable. But at the last moment, something stayed his hand. The blade stopped inches from Sarah's neck, trembling with the force of his barely controlled rage. "You know nothing," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I know enough," Sarah said softly. "I know you are not the monster they believe you to be." The story had begun 6 months earlier, when the longships appeared on the horizon like harbors of death. Sarah Gonzalez had been working in her family's olive grove outside the coastal village of Valdres when the raiders struck. She remembered the sound of their war cries carrying across the water, the sight of their dragon-headed ships cutting through the morning mist like creatures from nightmare. Her village had no defenses against such an attack. The men were fishermen and farmers, not warriors. When the Vikings came ashore with their axes and shields, resistance crumbled within minutes. Sarah had tried to run, following the path that led up into the mountains where her people sometimes hid during times of trouble. But the raiders had anticipated such flight, sending groups of warriors to cut off the escape routes. She was captured less than a mile from her home, pulled from a thorn thicket where she had tried to hide. The Viking who found her was a young man with red hair and cruel eyes. Someone she would later learn was called Jerry Howard. He bound her hands with rough rope and dragged her back to the beach where other captives were being gathered. The scene that greeted her there would haunt her dreams for months to come. Bodies lay scattered across the sand, villagers who had tried to fight or had simply been in the wrong place when the killing began. Her father was among them, his fishing net still clutched in his dead hands. Her mother and younger sister were nowhere to be seen, and Sarah never learned what became of them. The raiders loaded their human cargo onto the ships with the same casual efficiency they showed when handling any other valuable goods. Sarah found herself chained in the hold of the largest vessel, pressed against dozens of other captives from villages up and down the coast. The air was thick with the smell of fear and vomit as the ship began its journey north. The voyage lasted 2 weeks, during which time Sarah learned the harsh realities of captivity. Food and water were scarce, distributed only when the Vikings remembered or felt generous. Several of the older captives died during the crossing, their bodies thrown overboard without ceremony. The survivors huddled together for warmth and what little comfort they could provide each other. It was during this voyage that Sarah first saw Alexander Kelly, though she did not learn his name until much later. He would sometimes come down into the hold to check on the captives, his pale eyes scanning the crowded space with the detached interest of a farmer counting livestock. He never spoke to them, never showed any sign that he saw them as human beings rather than cargo. But Sarah noticed things about him that others missed. The way he always ensured the captives received their full ration of water, even when supplies ran low. The way he positioned himself between the prisoners and the more brutal members of the crew when tensions ran high. Small acts of mercy that he seemed to perform without conscious thought, as if some buried part of his humanity still functioned, despite the layers of violence and hardness that covered it. When they finally reached the northern settlement that would become Sarah's prison, she was struck by the harsh beauty of the landscape. Towering mountains rose from the edge of a steel-gray sea, their peaks already touched with early snow, despite the season. The settlement itself was a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a natural harbor, protected from the worst of the weather by high stone walls. The captives were divided among the various households according to their perceived value and skills. Sarah, being young and healthy despite the rigors of the voyage, was assigned to work in the communal kitchens and to tend the settlement's small herd of goats. It was hard labor that left her exhausted at the end of each day, but it was better than the fate that befell some of the other prisoners. She was housed in a small wooden cage barely large enough for her to lie down in, located in a corner of Alexander Kelly's compound. This arrangement puzzled her at first, since Alexander seemed to have no direct need for her services. She later learned that he had claimed her specifically to prevent her from being given to Stephen Peterson, a Viking known for his cruelty toward female captives. The first weeks were a blur of survival and adaptation. Sarah learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the settlement, to recognize which Vikings could be approached for small favors and which ones were best avoided entirely. She discovered that showing too much spirit would earn her a beating, but appearing completely broken would mark her as useless and expendable. The work was backbreaking and the conditions harsh, but Sarah endured. She had been raised in a family that valued resilience and hard work, and those lessons served her well in captivity. More importantly, she had something that many of the other prisoners lacked: a reason to survive. Somewhere in the world, her mother and sister might still be alive. If she could endure long enough, she might find a way to escape and search for them. As autumn gave way to winter, the settlement began its preparations for the long months of cold and darkness ahead. Food was preserved and stored, weapons were sharpened and repaired, and the buildings were reinforced against the coming storms. For the captives, winter meant even greater hardship as resources became scarce, and the Vikings grew more irritable and violent. It was during this time that Sarah began to notice patterns in Alexander Kelly's behavior. He was clearly the settlement's most skilled warrior, respected and feared in equal measure by his peers. But he also seemed to carry a burden that set him apart from the others. He drank alone, fought with a reckless fury that suggested he cared little for his own survival, and sometimes disappeared for days at a time without explanation. The other captives spoke of him in whispers, sharing stories of his legendary cruelty and the terrible fate that awaited anyone who crossed him. They called him the Scarred One, referring to the network of old wounds that covered his face and arms. Some claimed he had killed 100 men in battle. Others whispered that he had once burned an entire village to the ground in a fit of rage. But Sarah began to suspect that these stories, while perhaps based in truth, did not tell the whole story of who Alexander Kelly really was. The first test of Sarah's endurance came with the onset of true winter, when the temperature dropped so low that even breathing became painful. The settlement's other captives began to succumb one by one, claimed by cold, disease, or simple despair. Sarah watched helplessly as people she had come to know and care about simply gave up the fight to survive. There was Carol Myers, a middle-aged woman from a fishing village who had been captured along with her teenage son. She had endured months of backbreaking labor without complaint, sustained by the hope of protecting her child. But when the boy died of fever in the depths of winter, something broke inside her. She stopped eating, stopped responding to commands, and within a week she was dead. Andrew Castillo had been a merchant before his capture, a man accustomed to comfort and soft living. The physical demands of captivity wore him down steadily, but it was the psychological torture that ultimately destroyed him. The Vikings took pleasure in describing in graphic detail what they planned to do to his wife and daughters when they raided his home city. He lasted until the winter solstice before hanging himself with strips torn from his own clothing. One by one, Sarah watched her fellow prisoners fade away. Some died quickly, claimed by violence or accident. Others lingered for weeks or months, their bodies gradually failing as their spirits broke. By midwinter, she was one of only 5 captives remaining from the original group of 30. It was during this darkest period that Sarah's relationship with Alexander Kelly began to change in subtle ways. She had been tending the settlement's goats one morning when a pack of wolves attacked the herd. The animals scattered in panic, and Sarah found herself cornered by 2 of the predators, their yellow eyes fixed on her with hungry intelligence. She had no weapon except a wooden staff used for herding, no armor except the rough woolen dress that provided little protection against claws and fangs. The wolves circled her slowly, taking their time, sensing that their prey had nowhere to run. Sarah gripped her staff with both hands and prepared to sell her life as dearly as possible. The attack came without warning. The larger of the 2 wolves launched itself at her throat while its companion went for her legs. Sarah managed to strike the first animal across the muzzle with her staff, but the blow only served to enrage it further. She stumbled backward, knowing that she had only seconds before the wolves overwhelmed her completely. Then Alexander Kelly appeared like an avenging spirit, his axe already in motion. The blade took the first wolf in the side, nearly cutting the animal in half. The second predator turned to face this new threat, but Alexander was ready for it. His sayax, the long knife that all Vikings carried, found the wolf's heart before it could leap. Sarah stood frozen in the aftermath, her staff still raised defensively, unable to quite believe that she was still alive. Alexander cleaned his weapons methodically, his movements calm and efficient despite the violence he had just unleashed. When he finally looked at her, his pale eyes showed no emotion. "The goats," he said simply, "gather them." It was the first time he had spoken directly to her since her capture months earlier. Sarah nodded and began the task of rounding up the scattered animals, her hands shaking with delayed reaction. When she had finished, she expected Alexander to simply walk away, but instead he lingered. "You did not run," he observed. Sarah met his burima, trying to read the expression on his scarred face. "Where would I go?" she asked. Something flickered in Alexander's eyes, there and gone so quickly that she might have imagined it. "Most would have run anyway," he said, even knowing it was useless. He left without another word, but something had changed between them. Sarah could not define exactly what it was, but she sensed that she had passed some kind of test. Over the following days, she noticed small differences in how Alexander treated her. He still showed no warmth or kindness, but there was a new quality of attention in how he watched her work. The change became more pronounced when fever struck the settlement a few weeks later. It was a sickness that came with the deep winter, claiming the old and the weak with ruthless efficiency. Several Vikings died along with the remaining captives, except for Sarah and one other woman named Donna Morales. Alexander was among those who fell ill, though his strong constitution allowed him to fight the fever longer than most. Sarah watched from her cage as he grew increasingly weak, his usual commanding presence reduced to occasional delirious mutterings. The other Vikings avoided his dwelling, partly from fear of contagion and partly because they were uncomfortable seeing their most formidable warrior in such a vulnerable state. On the fourth night of Alexander's illness, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her captivity. She picked the simple lock on her cage using a piece of wire she had hidden for months and made her way to Alexander's dwelling. The building was larger than most in the settlement, befitting his status, but it was spartanly furnished and bitterly cold. Alexander lay on a pile of furs near the central fire pit, his body racked with shivering despite the fever that burned through him. His face was flushed and slick with sweat, and his breathing came in short, labored gasps. Sarah had seen enough sickness in her life to recognize that he was dying. She spent the night tending him, feeding the fire to keep the dwelling warm, forcing water between his cracked lips, and using damp cloths to cool his burning skin. It was dangerous work that could easily have cost her life if she had been discovered, but something compelled her to continue. During the worst of the fever, Alexander began to speak in his delirium. Most of it was incomprehensible, fragments of old battles and half-remembered conversations. But gradually a pattern emerged. He spoke repeatedly of a woman named Ashley Thomas, calling out to her in tones of desperate longing and regret. "I should have saved you," he whispered during one particularly bad episode. "I should have been faster, stronger. I should have died instead." Sarah listened to these confessions with growing understanding. Whatever had happened to this Ashley Thomas, it had broken something fundamental inside Alexander Kelly. The scars on his body were nothing compared to the wounds he carried in his soul. As dawn approached, Alexander's fever finally broke. He woke to find Sarah sitting beside him, her hand cool against his forehead. For a moment, confusion flickered across his features as he tried to process her presence in his dwelling. Then his usual mask of cold control slammed back into place. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the fever. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Because you saved me from the wolves," she said finally, "and because no one should die alone." Alexander studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read some hidden meaning in her words. Then he closed his eyes and turned away. "Go back to your cage," he said quietly. Sarah obeyed, but she knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. She had seen Alexander Kelly at his most vulnerable, had heard the pain that he kept hidden beneath his warrior's facade, and perhaps more importantly, he had allowed her to help him, had accepted her care when he could easily have driven her away or killed her for her presumption. Spring came slowly to the northern settlement, marked more by subtle changes in the light than any real warmth in the air. Sarah had survived her first winter in captivity, an achievement that even the Vikings acknowledged with grudging respect. She was now the only captive remaining from the original group, a fact that carried both pride and profound loneliness. The settlement began to stir with new energy as the worst of the winter weather passed. Ships were prepared for the raiding season, weapons were sharpened, and plans were made for the expeditions that would bring fresh wealth and captives to the community. For Sarah, the approaching season brought both hope and dread. Hope, because the increased activity might provide opportunities for escape. Dread, because she knew that new captives would soon arrive to replace those who had died during the winter. Her relationship with Alexander Kelly had evolved into something complex and undefined. He still treated her as a thrall, giving her orders and expecting instant obedience. But there were moments when she caught him watching her with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful, as if he were trying to solve some puzzle that she represented. He had never thanked her for caring for him during his illness, nor had he acknowledged what had passed between them during those fevered nights. But small changes in his behavior suggested that he had not forgotten. Her rations were slightly larger than before. Her cage was moved to a more sheltered location. When other Vikings made crude comments about what they would like to do to her, Alexander's presence nearby was enough to silence them. It was during this time of gradual warming that Charles Cruz arrived at the settlement. He was a Viking from a neighboring community, a man with a reputation for exceptional cruelty, even by the standards of his people. He had come to discuss potential raids and to trade for supplies, but his attention was immediately drawn to Sarah. "So this is the southern woman who survived the winter," he said, circling her like a predator evaluating prey. "I had heard stories, but I thought they were exaggerated." Sarah kept her eyes downcast, having learned that direct eye contact with strange Vikings was often interpreted as a challenge. But she could feel Charles Cruz's gaze on her like a physical weight, and something in his tone made her skin crawl. "She is strong," Alexander replied neutrally. "Good for work." Charles laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Work, yes, but surely she has other uses as well. It has been a long winter, and a man has needs." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily, but she forced herself to remain still. She had learned that showing fear or anger in such situations only encouraged men like Charles Cruz. "She is mine," Alexander said, and there was something in his voice that made Charles's smile falter slightly. Of course," Charles replied quickly. "I meant no disrespect, but perhaps we could come to some arrangement. I have goods to trade, silver and amber from the eastern routes. Surely one thrall is not worth more than profit." Alexander's response was a long moment of silence that seemed to stretch between the two men like a drawn bowstring. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "She is not for trade." Charles Cruz was not a man accustomed to being refused, especially not when it came to something he desired. His face darkened with anger, and his hand moved instinctively toward the axe at his belt. Around them, other Vikings began to take notice of the tension, sensing that violence might erupt at any moment. "You have grown soft, Alexander Kelly," Charles said, his voice carrying clearly across the settlement's central courtyard. "Time was when you would have shared your spoils with a fellow warrior. Now you hoard a single thrall like a miser counting coins." The insult was carefully chosen and publicly delivered, designed to force Alexander into a response that would either cost him face or blood. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that she had become the center of a conflict that could easily turn deadly. Alexander's hand moved to his own weapon, but his movement was controlled and deliberate rather than angry. "You question my generosity, Mon?" he asked, his tone conversational despite the threat implicit in his posture. "I question your judgment," Charles replied. "What use is a thrall who makes you weak?" The challenge was now explicit and public. By the harsh codes that governed Viking society, Alexander had no choice but to respond with violence or accept permanent damage to his reputation. Sarah found herself holding her breath, knowing that her fate hung in the balance of whatever happened next. But Alexander Kelly had not survived countless battles by being predictable. Instead of drawing his weapon, he smiled, and the expression on his scarred face was more frightening than any display of rage. "You think she makes me weak?" he asked. "Then prove it. Challenge me, Charles Cruz. Show everyone here how soft I have become." The offer caught Charles off guard. He had been trying to goad Alexander into an angry, poorly considered response, not a formal duel. Fighting Alexander Kelly in single combat was not something any sane man would choose to do, regardless of how confident he felt. "I have no quarrel with you personally," Charles said, his bravado beginning to waver. "I simply think you are making a mistake." "Then help me correct it." Alexander replied, his smile never wavering. Draw your blade and show me the error of my ways. The standoff stretched between them while the gathered Vikings watched in fascination. This was exactly the kind of drama that their society thrived on, a public test of strength and will that would be remembered and retold for years to come. Charles Cruz found himself trapped by his own words, unable to back down without losing face, but equally unable to accept a challenge he was unlikely to survive. In the end, it was Nancy Gomez who broke the deadlock. She was Charles's wife, a woman known for her political cunning and her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Viking society. She approached the two men with a smile that managed to be both deferential and commanding. Surely there is no need for bloodshed between allies, she said, her voice carrying the authority of her position. Charles spoke in haste, driven by admiration for such a remarkable thrall, rather than any desire to cause offense. It was a face-saving lie that allowed both men to step back from the brink without losing honor. Charles seized the opportunity eagerly, nodding his agreement and offering a grudging apology for his words. Alexander accepted the gesture with cool grace, but Sarah could see the tension that remained in his shoulders. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew that Charles Cruz would not forget this humiliation. Men like him rarely let such slights go unavenged, and she suspected that this confrontation had only delayed rather than resolved the conflict. That night, Sarah lay awake in her cage, listening to the sounds of the settlement around her. The Vikings were celebrating the arrival of their guests with drinking and storytelling, their voices carrying clearly through the thin walls of the buildings. She could hear Charles Cruz's laughter among the others, loud and forced, as if he were trying too hard to show that the afternoon's confrontation had not affected him. Sleep eluded her as she replayed the events of the day in her mind. She had become a symbol of something in the conflict between Alexander and Charles, though she was not entirely sure what that something was. The realization that her survival might depend on dynamics she barely understood was deeply unsettling. Near midnight, she heard footsteps approaching her cage. She tensed, expecting to see Charles Cruz or one of his men, but it was Alexander who emerged from the shadows. He carried a small oil lamp that cast flickering light across his scarred features, making him look like some ancient god of war. Come, he said quietly, unlocking her cage. There is something you need to see. Sarah followed him through the dark settlement, her bare feet silent on the cold ground. Alexander led her to a small rise overlooking the harbor, where they could see the black waters stretching away toward the horizon. The moon was nearly full, casting a silver path across the waves that seemed to lead to another world entirely. Why did you really care for me during the fever? Alexander asked without preamble. The question caught Sarah off guard. She had expected him to discuss the confrontation with Charles Cruz, or perhaps to warn her about the dangers that lay ahead. Instead, he seemed focused on understanding her motivations from weeks earlier. I told you, she said carefully, because you saved me from the wolves. Alexander shook his head. That was part of it, perhaps, but not all. You could have let me die and improved your chances of escape when the settlement was distracted by my death. Instead, you risked your life to help me. Why? Sarah considered her answer, knowing that honesty might be dangerous, but sensing that lies would be worse. Because I saw something in you that the others do not see, she said finally. You are not the monster they believe you to be. You know nothing of what I am, Alexander replied, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held that morning. I know you dream of Ashley Thomas, Sarah said quietly. I know her loss haunts you in ways that no physical wound ever could. I know you blame yourself for something that was probably beyond your control. Alexander was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the moonlit water. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She was taken in a raid 3 summers ago, he said. I was leading a group of warriors to intercept the raiders, but we were too late. By the time we reached her village, it was already burning. I found her body among the others, and I knew that if I had been faster, stronger, better, she might still be alive. You cannot save everyone, Sarah said gently. I could not save anyone, Alexander replied with bitter emphasis. Not her, not the others who died that day, not even myself. I have been dead inside ever since, going through the motions of living without any real purpose. Sarah felt a stab of sympathy for this man, who had caused her so much suffering. She began to understand that his cruelty toward captives was not born of natural sadism, but of a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, in the face of overwhelming grief and guilt. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Alexander turned to look at her, and in the moonlight she could see the pain that he usually kept hidden beneath his warrior's mask. "Because you are the first person who has seen past the scars to whatever might be left of the man I used to be. And because Charles Cruz will try to kill you before he leaves this settlement." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had suspected that the confrontation earlier was not over, but hearing it stated so bluntly made the danger feel immediate and real. "When did they?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because hurting you is the only way he can hurt me without risking a direct confrontation," Alexander replied. "He knows that killing you would be the cruelest blow he could strike, and he is exactly the kind of man who would take pleasure in such indirect revenge." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What can we do?" "What do we?" Alexander asked, and there was something almost like surprise in his voice. "There is no we in this, thrall. You are my property, nothing more." But even as he said the words, Sarah could see that he did not believe them. Something had changed between them during their months together. Some connection that neither of them fully understood or acknowledged. She was no longer simply a captive to him, just as he was no longer simply her captor to her. "Then why warn me at all?" she challenged. Alexander had no answer for that question, or at least none that he was willing to share. Instead, he turned away from her and began walking back toward the settlement. "Stay close to me tomorrow," he said over his shoulder. "Do not go anywhere alone, and do not trust anyone except me." Sarah followed him back to her cage, her mind racing with implications and possibilities. She was trapped between forces beyond her control, dependent on a man who claimed to see her as nothing more than property, but who had just revealed depths of pain and vulnerability that he shared with no one else. As Alexander locked her cage and disappeared into the night, Sarah realized that her survival might depend not just on her own strength and cunning, but on the fragile connection that had grown between her and the scarred Viking warrior who held her life in his hands. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A messenger arrived at dawn with word that a large force of raiders was approaching from the south, flying the banners of Stephen Peterson, a rival chieftain known for his ambition and ruthlessness. The settlement immediately began preparing for either battle or siege, depending on Stephen Peterson's intentions. Charles Cruz saw opportunity in the chaos. While Alexander was occupied with defensive preparations, Charles approached Sarah as she worked in the goat pen. His smile was cold and predatory, and she knew immediately that the confrontation Alexander had warned her about was at hand. "The scarred one cannot protect you now," Charles said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "He has more important things to worry about than one insignificant thrall." Sarah's hands tightened on the wooden bucket she had been using to carry water to the goats. The animals sensed the tension in the air and began to bleat nervously, pressing against the far side of their pen. Charles Cruz stepped closer, and she could smell the ale on his breath from the previous night's drinking. "You have caused me considerable embarrassment," Charles continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Alexander Kelly may think he can humiliate me without consequence, but he is wrong. And you, little thrall, are going to help me teach him that lesson." Sarah forced herself to remain calm despite the fear that clawed at her chest. "I have done nothing to you," she said quietly. Charles laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You exist," he replied. "That is enough. You have made Alexander soft, turned him into something less than the warrior he once was. For that alone, you deserve whatever fate awaits you." Before Sarah could respond, Charles grabbed her arm with bruising force and began dragging her away from the goat pen. She dropped the bucket and tried to pull free, but his grip was like iron. Around them, the settlement buzzed with activity as Vikings prepared for the approaching threat, too distracted to notice one thrall being manhandled by a visiting warrior. Charles pulled her toward a storage building at the edge of the settlement, a structure that would muffle any sound she might make. Sarah realized with growing horror that he intended to assault her, to use her body as a weapon against Alexander Kelly. The knowledge filled her with a rage that burned away her fear. "Let me go," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. "Or what?" Charles sneered. "You will call for help? Who do you think will come? Alexander is busy preparing for battle, and the others see you as nothing more than property to be used as I see fit." He was probably right, Sarah realized. In the hierarchy of Viking society, she ranked far below Charles Cruz, and any complaint she made would likely be dismissed or ignored. But she was no longer the terrified captive who had arrived at the settlement months earlier. The winter had changed her, hardened her in ways that went beyond mere physical endurance. When Charles reached for the door of the storage building, Sarah acted. She drove her knee upward with all the force she could muster, catching him in the groin. Charles doubled over with a grunt of pain and surprise, his grip on her arm loosening. Sarah twisted free and ran, her bare feet slipping on the muddy ground. Behind her, Charles roared with rage and gave chase. He was larger and stronger than her, but Sarah knew the settlement's layout better than he did. She dodged between buildings and through narrow alleyways, using every trick she had learned during her months of captivity. But Charles Cruz was an experienced warrior, and he quickly adapted to her tactics. He began herding her away from the main areas of the settlement, using his knowledge of her likely escape routes to cut off her options. Sarah realized with growing desperation that he was driving her toward the outer walls, where there would be fewer people to witness whatever he intended to do. She burst into the settlement's central courtyard just as Alexander Kelly emerged from the main hall, his armor gleaming and his weapons ready for battle. Their eyes met across the open space, and Sarah saw understanding flash across his scarred features. He took in her disheveled appearance, Charles Cruz pursuing her with murder in his eyes, and the obvious conclusion that could be drawn from the scene. "Charles," Alexander called out, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "Is there some problem with my thrall?" Charles skidded to a halt, suddenly aware that they had an audience. Other Vikings had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion and the prospect of entertainment. Nancy Gomez appeared at her husband's wing, her face tight with concern as she assessed the situation. "The thrall attacked me," Charles said, trying to project injured innocence. "I was merely attempting to discipline her for her insolence." Alexander's pale eyes shifted to Sarah, and she could see him evaluating her appearance, looking for signs of injury or assault. His gaze lingered on the bruises forming on her arm, where Charles had gripped her, and something cold and deadly flickered across his features. "What did she do?" Alexander asked, his tone deceptively casual. Charles seemed to realize that he was on dangerous ground, but he had committed himself to his story. "She refused a direct order and then struck me when I attempted to correct her behavior. Such defiance cannot be tolerated." "No," Alexander agreed. "It cannot." He turned to Sarah, and for a moment she feared that he would side with Charles to avoid further conflict. "What do you have to say for yourself, thrall?" Sarah met his eyes and saw something there that gave her courage. "He lies," she said simply. "He tried to force himself on me. I defended myself." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Around the courtyard, the gathered Vikings murmured among themselves, some with approval for Sarah's boldness and others with disapproval for her presumption in challenging a free man's word. Charles's face flushed with anger. "You would take the word of a thrall over that of a fellow warrior?" he demanded. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Sarah and Charles as if weighing their competing claims. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and implacable. "I would take the word of someone who has proven their honesty over someone who has not," he said. "Sarah Gonzalez has never lied to me. Can you say the same, Charles Cruz?" The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. Alexander was calling Charles's honor into question in front of witnesses, a serious accusation that demanded a response. Charles's hand moved toward his weapon, but Nancy Gomez caught his arm. "Husband," she said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this privately. Surely there has been some misunderstanding that can be resolved without bloodshed." But Charles was beyond reason, driven by wounded pride and frustrated desire. He shook off his wife's restraining hand and drew his sword, the blade singing as it cleared the scabbard. "I will not be called a liar by a man who has grown soft over a southern whore," he snarled. Defend yourself, Alexander Kelly, or be known as a coward as well as a fool. Alexander sighed as if the confrontation were more tedious than threatening. He drew his own sword with fluid grace, the weapon seeming to come alive in his hands. Around them, the other Vikings formed a rough circle, giving the combatants room to fight while ensuring that neither could flee. This is foolish, Alexander said, making one last attempt to avoid violence. You cannot win this fight. Charles, walk away now, and we will speak no more of what has passed between us. Charles's response was a wild swing that would have taken Alexander's head off if it had connected. But Alexander was no longer where the blade expected to find him, having flowed aside with the liquid grace of a born warrior. His counterattack was swift and economical, a thrust that opened a long cut along Charles's sword arm. Blood began to flow, staining Charles's sleeve crimson. The wound was not immediately dangerous, but it served as a reminder of the skill differential between the two men. Charles attacked again, this time with more caution, but the result was the same. Alexander's blade found its mark, while his opponent's did not. The fight continued for several more minutes, but the outcome was never in doubt. Alexander Kelly was simply the better warrior, faster and more skilled than his opponent. He could have ended the combat at any time, but instead he chose to demonstrate his superiority through a series of precise cuts that left Charles increasingly bloodied and desperate. Finally, Charles made a mistake born of frustration and pain. He overextended himself in a clumsy thrust, leaving himself open for the counter that everyone knew was coming. Alexander's blade found his throat, the point coming to rest just above his collarbone. Yield, Alexander said quietly. Charles Cruz looked into the pale eyes of the man who held his life in balance, and whatever he saw there convinced him that further resistance would be fatal. I yield, he whispered. Alexander stepped back and lowered his sword, but he did not sheath the weapon. You will leave this settlement within the hour, he said. You will not return, and if I ever hear that you have spoken my name or hers with anything less than respect, I will find you and finish what we started here today. Charles nodded, his face pale with blood loss and humiliation. Nancy Gomez helped him to his feet, her expression carefully neutral, despite what must have been considerable anger at her husband's foolishness. The other Vikings began to disperse, already composing the stories they would tell about this confrontation. As the crowd thinned, Alexander approached Sarah. She stood frozen where the fight had begun, hardly able to believe that she had survived the encounter. When Alexander reached her, he studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Are you injured? He asked. Sarah shook her head, not trusting her voice. The bruises on her arm throbbed, but they were minor compared to what Charles Cruz had intended to do to her. Good, Alexander said. Then so quietly that only she could hear, he added, You fought well. Ashley Thomas would have been proud. The comparison to his lost love should have felt like an insult, but instead Sarah found herself oddly moved by it. She understood that Alexander was offering her the highest compliment he knew how to give, comparing her courage to that of the woman who had meant everything to him. Before she could respond, a horn sounded from the settlement's watchtower. The approaching raiders had been spotted, and they would arrive within the hour. Alexander's attention immediately shifted to the more pressing threat, his personal concerns set aside in favor of the community's survival. Go to my dwelling, he told Sarah. Bar the door and do not open it for anyone except me. If the settlement falls, there is a loose stone in the back wall. Behind it you will find silver and supplies. Take them and flee north to the mountains. Sarah stared at him in shock. He was not only ensuring her immediate safety, but providing for her escape if the worst happened. It was the act of a man who cared about her welfare, regardless of what he might claim about her status as his property. Why? She asked. Alexander was already turning away, his mind focused on the battle to come. Because you have earned it, he said over his shoulder. Sarah made her way to Alexander's dwelling as instructed, her thoughts churning with the implications of what had just occurred. The confrontation with Charles Cruz had forced Alexander to publicly acknowledge that she meant something to him, that he valued her enough to risk his life defending her honor. The knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying. She barred the door as instructed and settled down to wait, listening to the sounds of preparation outside. Vikings shouted orders, weapons clashed as they were tested, and horses whinnied as riders prepared to meet the approaching threat. Through the small window, she could see Alexander moving among his men, his presence calm and reassuring despite the danger they faced. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. Stephen Peterson had brought nearly 100 warriors, far more than the settlement could field in its defense. But Alexander Kelly had chosen the battleground carefully, using the settlement's walls and the terrain to offset the numerical disadvantage. Sarah listened to the sounds of combat with growing anxiety, trying to interpret what was happening from the clash of weapons and the cries of wounded men. At times it seemed that the defenders were holding their own, but then a fresh wave of attackers would surge forward and the battle would hang in the balance once again. The fighting raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Sarah pressed herself against the wall near the window, trying to catch glimpses of Alexander among the combatants. She saw him several times, his scarred face grim with concentration as he wielded his weapons with deadly efficiency. Then disaster struck. A group of Stephen Peterson's warriors broke through the settlement's eastern wall, forcing the defenders to fight on two fronts simultaneously. Alexander was forced to divide his attention between the main assault and this new threat, and in that moment of distraction, one of Stephen Peterson's champions managed to land a serious blow. Sarah saw Alexander stagger and fall to one knee, blood streaming from a wound in his side. The sight filled her with a terror that she had not felt even during her own confrontation with Charles Cruz. Without conscious thought, she unbarred the door and ran toward the battle. The scene that greeted her in the courtyard was one of chaos and carnage. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, some moving weakly and others ominously still. The air was thick with the smell of blood and smoke from burning buildings. Through it all, the clash of weapons continued as the surviving defenders fought desperately to hold their ground. Sarah spotted Alexander near the settlement's main hall, surrounded by enemies but still fighting with grim determination. His movements were slower than usual, hampered by his wound, but his skill remained formidable. As she watched, his blade found the throat of one attacker and opened the belly of another. But there were too many of them, and Alexander was weakening from blood loss. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that he was going to die unless someone intervened. The knowledge galvanized her into action. She ran to the nearest fallen warrior and grabbed his spear, the weapon heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. She had never used such a thing before, but desperation gave her strength and purpose. Without hesitation, she charged toward the group surrounding Alexander. Her first thrust took one of Stephen Peterson's warriors in the back, the spear point sliding between his ribs to find his heart. The man fell without a sound, and Sarah wrenched the weapon free just as another attacker turned to face this new threat. The sight of a thrall armed and fighting seemed to shock the Vikings into momentary stillness. It was unthinkable that a captive would involve herself in such a battle, let alone do so effectively. That moment of surprise was all Alexander needed to regain the initiative. His axe took the nearest enemy in the chest, splitting mail and bone with equal ease. His sayax found the gap in another man's armor, sliding home in with practiced precision. In seconds, the group that had been overwhelming him was reduced to scattered corpses. Alexander turned to look at Sarah, his pale eyes wide with something that might have been amazement. She stood over the body of the man she had killed, the bloody spear still clutched in her hands, her face set in lines of fierce determination. "Why?" he asked, echoing her earlier question. "Because you are not the monster they believe you to be," Sarah replied, using his own words from their moonlit conversation. "And because no one should die alone." Before Alexander could respond, Stephen Peterson himself appeared, having fought his way through the defenders to reach his primary target. The rival chieftain was a large man with graying hair and scars that spoke of countless battles. His presence on the field meant that the battle was entering its final phase. "Alexander Kelly," Stephen Peterson called out, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I have come for what you owe me." Alexander straightened despite his wound, his weapons ready. "I owe you nothing, Stephen Peterson." "You owe me the life of my son," Stephen Peterson replied, his voice thick with old grief and newer rage. "Jerry Howard died in your last raid, cut down by your blade. His death demands payment in blood." Sarah remembered Jerry Howard, the red-haired Viking who had captured her during the raid on her village. He had been cruel and brutal, taking pleasure in the suffering of his captives, But she also understood that to Stephen Peterson, he had been a beloved son whose loss demanded vengeance. Jerry Howard died as warriors die, Alexander replied, with a weapon in his hand and his face to his enemies. There is no debt to be paid. There is, Stephen Peterson snarled, raising his sword, and you will pay it with your life. The two chieftains circled each other, while their surviving followers formed a rough ring around them. This was the moment that the entire battle had been building toward, the personal confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the settlement, but the lives of everyone within it. Alexander was the more skilled fighter, but his wound had weakened him significantly. Stephen Peterson was older but unwounded, and his rage gave him strength beyond his years. The fight would be closer than Sarah would have liked. The duel began with a series of cautious probes as each man tested his opponent's defenses. Alexander's sword work was elegant and precise, each movement economical and purposeful. Stephen Peterson fought with the brutal efficiency of a man who had survived decades of warfare, his attacks designed to overwhelm rather than outmaneuver. Sarah watched the combat with her heart in her throat, knowing that Alexander's life hung in the balance. She still held the spear she had taken from the fallen warrior, but she knew that interfering in a formal duel would be seen as the height of dishonor by both sides. All she could do was watch and hope. The tide of battle shifted back and forth as the two warriors tested each other. Alexander's superior skill allowed him to score several minor wounds, but Stephen Peterson's greater strength and endurance began to tell as the fight continued. Alexander's movements grew slightly slower, his parries a fraction less precise. Then Stephen Peterson made his move, a powerful overhead strike designed to split Alexander's skull. Alexander got his sword up in time to block, but the force of the blow drove him to one knee. Stephen Peterson pressed his advantage, raining down a series of heavy blows that Alexander could barely deflect. Sarah saw the moment when Alexander's strength finally began to fail him. His guard dropped slightly, and Stephen Peterson's blade slipped through to open a cut across his chest. It was not a fatal wound, but it was deep enough to weaken him further. "You die now, Alexander Kelly," Stephen Peterson panted, raising his sword for the killing blow. "Join my son in whatever hell awaits warriors who fall in battle." But as the blade descended, Sarah acted without conscious thought. She hurled the spear with all her strength, the weapon spinning through the air to take Stephen Peterson in the shoulder. The impact spun him around and spoiled his aim, the sword that should have found Alexander's heart, instead biting deep into the ground beside him. Stephen Peterson roared with pain and rage, his eyes finding Sarah among the crowd of watchers. "Thrall," he snarled, "you dare interfere in a warrior's duel?" "I dare," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I dare because Alexander Kelly is worth 10 of you, and because your son was a coward who died as cowards die." The insult struck Stephen Peterson like a physical blow. Jerry Howard's reputation had been built on cruelty rather than courage, and everyone present knew it. To have that truth spoken aloud by a thrall was an humiliation beyond bearing. Stephen Peterson abandoned Alexander and charged towards Sarah, his sword raised high. But he had forgotten that Alexander Kelly was still very much alive and very much armed. Alexander's blade took him in the back, sliding between his ribs to find his heart. Stephen Peterson stumbled and fell, his sword clattering away across the stones. He looked up at Alexander with eyes that were already growing dim, and his lips moved in what might have been a curse or a prayer. "Tell Jerry Howard that I remember him," Alexander said quietly. "Tell him that his death was quick and clean, as befits a warrior." Stephen Peterson's eyes closed, and he was still. Around the courtyard, his surviving followers began to lay down their weapons, recognizing that their leader's death meant the end of their cause. The battle was over, and the settlement had survived. Alexander stood swaying over his fallen enemy, his face pale from blood loss and exhaustion. Sarah dropped the broken shaft of the spear and ran to him, catching him as his legs gave way. He was heavier than she had expected, but she managed to support his weight as he struggled to remain conscious. "Oui, mais," he asked again, the question that seemed to define their relationship. "Because I love you," Sarah said simply, the words coming from some deep place within her that she had not known existed. "Because you saved me in ways that have nothing to do with wolves or raiders. because you showed me that even in the darkest places, there can be light. Alexander's pale eyes focused on her face with an intensity that took her breath away. You should not love me, he whispered. I am not worthy of such a gift. That is not your choice to make, Sarah replied firmly. Love is not given because it is deserved. It is given because it is felt. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his breathing labored from his wounds. Around them, the settlement began the grim work of tending the wounded and counting the dead. The immediate danger had passed, but there would be much to do in the days ahead. Ashley Thomas is dead, Alexander said finally. She has been dead for 3 years, and I have been dead with her, but you— He paused, struggling to find the words. You make me want to live again. Sarah felt tears she had not known she was shedding track down her cheeks. Then live, she said. Live for both of us. Alexander reached up with one blood-stained hand to touch her face, his fingers gentle despite their calluses and scars. I do not know how to love anymore, he admitted. The part of me that knew such things died with her. Then learn again, Sarah said. We have time. Alexander smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, the expression reached his eyes. Time, he repeated. Yes, perhaps we do. As the sun set over the battle-scarred settlement, Sarah helped Alexander to his dwelling where she could tend his wounds properly. The other Vikings watched them go with expressions that ranged from amazement to approval. A thrall had fought beside their greatest warrior and helped save their community. Such a thing had never been seen before. But then Sarah Gonzalez had always been different from other captives. That night, as Sarah cleaned and bandaged Alexander's wounds, they talked quietly about the future. The settlement would need to be rebuilt, the dead would need to be honored, and decisions would have to be made about what came next. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt something that she had almost forgotten. Hope. What happens now? She asked as she tied off the last bandage. Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Now you choose, he said finally. You are no longer my thrall, if you ever truly were. You have earned your freedom through your courage and your loyalty. You can leave this place, return to your homeland, seek out whatever family you have left. Sarah felt a stab of longing at the mention of her mother and sister, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what she would be leaving behind. And if I choose to stay, then you stay as my equal, Alexander replied. Not as a captive or a servant, but as a partner. The choice is yours, Sarah Gonzalez. It has always been yours. Sarah looked around the dwelling that had become more familiar to her than her childhood home. She thought of the long journey that had brought her to this moment, from the olive groves of her youth to the harsh beauty of the northern wilderness. She thought of the woman she had been when the raiders first took her, and the woman she had become through months of hardship and growth. I choose to stay, she said. I choose you. Alexander's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Then we begin again, he said. Both of us, together. Spring turned to summer in the northern settlement, bringing with it a season of rebuilding and renewal. The damage from Stephen Peterson's attack was gradually repaired, new buildings rose where old ones had fallen, and life slowly returned to something approaching normalcy. But beneath the surface, fundamental changes were taking place that would reshape the community in ways both subtle and profound. Sarah's status within the settlement had been transformed by her actions during the battle. No longer seen as merely a captive, she was now regarded as something unprecedented, a thrall who had fought for her captors and earned a place among them through courage rather than birth. The other Vikings treated her with a mixture of respect and curiosity, unsure how to categorize someone who defied their usual understanding of social hierarchy. Alexander's attitude toward her had evolved as well, though the change was more gradual and complex than her acceptance by the community at large. He no longer gave her orders or expected automatic obedience, but old habits died hard, and he sometimes struggled with how to relate to her as an equal rather than property. Their conversations became longer and more personal, touching on subjects that neither of them would have dared discuss during the winter months. Tell me about your family, Alexander said one evening as they sat by the fire in his dwelling. The summer nights were short this far north, but they provided a welcome respite from the endless activity of the rebuilding effort. Sarah smiled, her thoughts turning to memories she had not allowed herself to dwell on for months. My father was a fisherman, she said. He had hands like leather from years of handling nets and lines, but he could play the lute like a master musician. My mother grew the most beautiful flowers in our village, roses and jasmine that filled our courtyard with perfume. And your sister? Maria was 3 years younger than me, all energy and laughter. She wanted to see the world beyond our village, to travel to the great cities and experience everything life had to offer. Sarah's voice grew soft with memory and loss. I used to think she was foolish for wanting to leave such a peaceful place. Now I wonder if she was the wisest of us all. Alexander was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Do you think they survived the raid? It was a question that Sarah had asked herself countless times, usually in the dark hours before dawn when sleep eluded her. I do not know, she admitted. I hope so, but I have learned not to build my life around hope alone. You could search for them, Alexander pointed out. I have contacts among the traders and raiders, people who might have information about what happened to the other captives from your village. Sarah considered the offer, touched by his willingness to help her find the family she had lost. But the woman who sat by his fire was not the same person who had been dragged from the olive grove months earlier. That Sarah Gonzalez had been defined by her relationships to others, daughter, sister, member of a community. This Sarah had learned to define herself. Perhaps someday, she said, but not now. I have found something here that I did not expect to find. What is that? Sarah met his eyes across the flickering flames. Myself, she said simply. Alexander nodded, understanding more than she might have expected. His own journey of self-discovery was ongoing, complicated by years of grief and guilt that could not be easily set aside. But Sarah's presence in his life had begun to show him possibilities he had thought were lost forever. Their relationship deepened through the summer months, built on shared experiences and growing trust rather than the dramatic declarations of love found in songs and stories. They worked together on the settlement's rebuilding, Alexander's leadership skills complementing Sarah's practical knowledge of farming and animal husbandry. They talked long into the short nights, sharing memories and dreams that they had never spoken aloud to anyone else. But their growing closeness was not without its complications. Viking society had rigid expectations about relationships between men and women, particularly when those relationships crossed the boundaries of social class. Some members of the community began to grumble about Alexander's obvious affection for a former thrall, questioning whether such an attachment was appropriate for their most prominent warrior. The criticism came to a head during the Midsummer Festival, when the settlement gathered to celebrate the longest day of the year. It was a time of feasting and storytelling, when old grievances were supposed to be set aside in favor of community harmony. But alcohol and tradition combined to loosen tongues that might otherwise have remained silent. Donna Morales, the only other surviving captive from Sarah's original group, had been adopted into one of the settlement's families after proving her worth as a healer. She approached Sarah during the festivities, her expression troubled. There is talk, she said quietly. Some of the women are saying that you have forgotten your place, that you presume too much in your relationship with Alexander Kelly. Sarah felt a familiar stab of anxiety, the old fear that her precarious position could be overturned at any moment. What kind of talk? They say that a thrall should not aspire to be the wife of a free man, no matter what services she might have performed. They worry that your example will encourage other captives to rebel against their proper stations. The criticism stung because it touched on Sarah's own doubts about her place in the settlement. She had earned respect through her actions, but she could not change the circumstances of her arrival or the fact that she would always be seen as an outsider by some members of the community. What do you think? Sarah asked. Donna Morales was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. I think that you have become something that this society does not have words for, she said finally. You are neither thrall nor free woman, neither Viking nor completely foreign. You exist in a space between categories, and that makes people uncomfortable. It was an astute observation that captured something Sarah had felt but had not been able to articulate. She was indeed caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither, but finding her own path through the complexity of her situation. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Alexander, who had been participating in the traditional contests of strength and skill that marked the festival. He looked magnificent in the firelight, his scars seeming to glow like badges of honor rather than marks of past pain. "Are you enjoying the celebration?" he asked, settling down beside Sarah on the log that served as their seat. "It is. Educational," Sarah replied diplomatically. Alexander's sharp eyes caught the tension in her posture and the meaningful look that passed between her and Donna Morales. "What has happened?" Sarah hesitated, reluctant to burden him with the community's gossip. But Alexander had learned to read her moods with increasing accuracy, and he was not easily deflected when he sensed something was wrong. "Some people question whether our relationship is appropriate," Sarah said finally. "They think I am overstepping the bounds of my station." Alexander's expression darkened, and Sarah could see the old anger stirring beneath his controlled exterior. "What people?" he asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "It does not matter," Sarah said quickly, placing a restraining hand on his arm. "They have the right to their opinions." "They have the right to keep their opinions to themselves," Alexander replied grimly. "You have earned your place here through courage and sacrifice. Anyone who questions that will answer to me." It was exactly the kind of protective response that Sarah had both hoped for and feared. Alexander's willingness to defend her was touching, but it also reinforced the perception that she needed his protection to maintain her position in the settlement. "I do not want to be the cause of conflict," Sarah said. "Perhaps it would be better if we were more discreet about our relationship." Alexander turned to face her fully, his pale eyes intense in the firelight. "Is that what you want? To hide what we have built together because some people are uncomfortable with change?" Sarah felt tears threatening and fought them back. "I want to belong here," she admitted. "Not as your property or your charity case, but as myself. I want to be accepted for who I am, not just tolerated because you protect me." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the festival crowd, where Vikings celebrated with the abandon that came from surviving another year in a harsh land. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "Acceptance cannot be demanded," he said. "It must be earned, and that takes time. But you have already begun that process, Sarah. Your actions during the battle prove that you belong here as much as anyone born to this life." "Then why do I still feel like an outsider?" Alexander smiled, and there was understanding in his expression. "Because you are an outsider," he said. "You always will be, just as I am an outsider in my own way. The scars on my face mark me as different, just as your accent marks you. But being different is not the same as being less." It was a perspective that Sarah had not considered, the idea that her foreignness might be a strength rather than a weakness. She thought of the skills she had brought to the settlement, the different ways of thinking that came from her Southern upbringing. Perhaps Alexander was right that acceptance would come with time, but perhaps it was also true that she did not need the approval of everyone to have value. The festival continued around them, but Sarah found herself lost in thought about Alexander's words. She watched the Vikings celebrating their traditions, noting the subtle hierarchies and unspoken rules that governed their interactions. It was a complex society built on concepts of honor and strength, but it was also more flexible than she had initially understood. "Tell me about Ashley Thomas," Sarah said suddenly, surprising herself with the request. Alexander's expression grew guarded, but he did not refuse to answer as he might have months earlier. "What do you want to know?" "What was she like? Not just that you loved her, but who she was as a person." Alexander was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he would not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "She was fierce," he said, "not in the way of a warrior, but in the way she approached life. She had opinions about everything and was never afraid to share them, even when they were unpopular. She could make anyone laugh, even in the darkest times." Sarah felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, but it was tempered by genuine curiosity about the woman who had shaped Alexander so profoundly. "She sounds wonderful," Sarah said, and meant it. "She was," Alexander agreed, "but she was also stubborn and impulsive, traits that ultimately led to her death. She insisted on staying in her village when the raids began, convinced that she could help organize a defense. I tried to persuade her to flee to safety, but she would not listen. You blame yourself for not forcing her to leave. Alexander nodded, his jaw tight with old pain. I could have taken her against her will, carried her away from the danger. Instead, I respected her choice and left her to face the consequences. It was the decision of a man who loved her, but it was also the decision that killed her. Sarah considered this revelation, understanding now why Alexander had been so controlling during her early months of captivity. His inability to save Ashley Thomas had left him determined never again to allow someone he cared about to make choices that might lead to their destruction. You cannot save people from themselves, Sarah said gently. Ashley Thomas made her choice as a free woman, just as I made mine when I chose to stay here with you. Taking away someone's right to choose is not protection. It is another form of captivity. Alexander looked at her with something that might have been surprise. You speak of choice, but what real choice did you have? You were a captive in a foreign land with nowhere to go and no resources to survive on your own. I had the choice to give up, Sarah replied. Many of the other captives made that choice, and I do not blame them for it. The winter was hard, and death would have been easier than endurance. But I chose to fight, to survive, to find meaning in circumstances that seemed meaningless. And now, Sarah smiled, feeling more certain than she had in months. And now I choose to build something new, not as a replacement for what I lost, but as something entirely different. I choose to love you, not because you saved me, but because of who you are and who you helped me to be. Alexander reached for her hand, his scarred fingers intertwining with hers. I do not know how to be the man you deserve, he admitted. Then learn, Sarah said, echoing her words from the night of the battle. We both have learning to do. The festival continued around them, but they sat quietly together, each lost in their own thoughts about the future they were building. It would not be an easy path, Sarah knew. There would be more challenges from those who questioned their relationship, more struggles to define their place in a society that had no precedence for what they were becoming. But for the first time since her capture, Sarah felt truly free, not because her chains had been removed, but because she had learned to see beyond them to possibilities she had never imagined. She was no longer the woman who had been taken from the olive grove, nor was she simply a Viking's thrall who had earned her freedom through service. She was something new, something uniquely her own. As the night wore on and the festival began to wind down, Alexander and Sarah made their way back to his dwelling. The building felt different now, less like a prison and more like a home. Sarah had added touches of her own over the summer months, herbs growing in small pots near the windows, woven baskets that she had made during the long evenings, a small loom where she created cloth and patterns that blended Viking techniques with designs from her homeland. I have something for you, Alexander said as they settled by the fire. He disappeared into the back room and returned with a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate knotwork. Sarah accepted it with curiosity, running her fingers over the smooth wood before lifting the lid. Inside, nestled in soft wool, was a silver arm ring of the type worn by free Viking women. It was beautifully crafted, with runes etched along its length that spelled out her name in the northern script. But more than its beauty, the gift represented something profound, recognition of her status as an equal rather than a possession. Alexander, Sarah breathed, lifting the arm ring from its resting place. It is beautiful. It is more than beautiful, Alexander said seriously. It is a declaration. Anyone who sees you wearing that ring will know that you are under my protection, not as a thrall, but as my chosen partner. It is a statement that we make together, a commitment to face whatever comes as equals. Sarah slipped the ring onto her arm, feeling its weight like a promise. What will the others say? They will say what they will say, Alexander replied, but they will say it with respect, or they will answer to me. Sarah laughed, recognizing the protective instinct that still drove him, but appreciating that it now came from love rather than possession. You cannot fight everyone who disapproves of us. Watch me, Alexander said with a grin that transformed his scarred features. They made love that night with a passion that was both desperate and tender, as if they were trying to seal their commitment with their bodies as well as their words. Afterward, they lay together in the flickering firelight, talking quietly about their plans for the future. I want to travel south when the weather turns, Alexander said, to trade but also to search for news of your family. It is time I saw more of the world than just these northern waters. Sarah felt a surge of excitement at the prospect. You would do that for me? I would do it for us, Alexander corrected. You are part of me now, Sarah Gonzalez. Your family is my family. Your homeland is a place I want to understand. It was a generous offer that spoke to how much Alexander had changed from the cold, controlled warrior she had first encountered. The man who lay beside her now was capable of growth and adaptation, willing to step outside his familiar world for the sake of their shared future. And if we find them, Sarah asked, if my mother and sister are alive, then we bring them here if they wish to come, Alexander said without hesitation. Or we find another way to help them. Family is sacred, Sarah. I learned that lesson too late to save Ashley Thomas. But perhaps it is not too late for us. Sarah felt tears of gratitude and love threaten to overwhelm her. This was the man she had chosen, not the fearsome warrior of reputation, but the complex, wounded, ultimately decent person who lay beneath the scars and armor. He was offering her not just his protection, but his partnership, not just his love, but his commitment to the things that mattered to her. I love you, she said simply, the words carrying all the weight of the journey that had brought them to this moment. And I love you, Alexander replied, his voice steady with certainty. More than I thought I could love anyone again. They slept deeply that night, wrapped in each other's arms and in the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The silver arm ring caught the dying firelight, a symbol of promises made and commitments sealed. Outside, the northern summer night was brief but beautiful, filled with the soft sounds of a settlement at peace. The long winter that had tested them both was a memory now, replaced by the warmth of a love that had grown from the most unlikely soil. Autumn came early to the northern settlement, bringing with it the first hints of the winter that would soon dominate the landscape once again. But this year, Sarah faced the approaching cold season with confidence rather than dread. She was no longer the terrified captive who had barely survived her first winter in this harsh land. She had become something new, a woman who belonged, who had earned her place through courage and determination. The changes in her status were visible throughout the settlement. Vikings who had once ignored her now sought her advice on matters ranging from animal husbandry to herbal medicine. Children who had been taught to see her as property now listened eagerly to her stories of the southern lands. Most importantly, the other women of the settlement had begun to accept her as one of their own, inviting her to participate in the social networks that bound the community together. Alexander's transformation was equally remarkable, though perhaps more subtle. The cold, controlled warrior who had killed 17 captives during Sarah's first winter had given way to a man capable of tenderness and growth. He still commanded respect through his martial skills, but his leadership now carried a quality of wisdom that had been absent before. Their relationship had become a model for others in the settlement, proof that love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances. Young Vikings sought Alexander's advice about their own romantic entanglements, while the settlement's women looked to Sarah as an example of how strength and femininity could coexist. But perhaps the most significant change was in how they saw themselves. Alexander no longer defined himself solely through his grief for Ashley Thomas, though her memory remained a cherished part of who he was. Sarah no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but as someone who had actively chosen her path and shaped her destiny. As the first snows began to fall, they made their preparations for the journey south that would consume much of the winter months. It would be a dangerous undertaking, traveling through territories controlled by hostile tribes and unpredictable weather. But it was also an adventure that represented their commitment to building a life together that honored both of their histories. Are you certain about this? Alexander asked, as they loaded supplies onto the small ship that would carry them south. The journey will be hard, and there is no guarantee that we will find the answers you seek. Sarah looked around the settlement that had become her home, taking in the familiar sights and sounds that had once seemed so foreign. She thought of the woman she had been when she first arrived here, broken and terrified and convinced that her life was over. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she remembered but could barely recognize. "I am certain," she said, her voice carrying the confidence that had grown within her over the months of hardship and growth. "Whatever we find, we will find it together." Alexander smiled, the expression transforming his scarred features with warmth and love. "Then let us go and discover what the world has to offer to people foolish enough to believe in second chances." They sailed south as the winter storms began to gather, their small ship cutting through waters that grew warmer with each passing day. Behind them, the northern settlement continued its eternal cycle of survival and renewal, but it would never again be quite the same place it had been before Sarah Gonzalez arrived to challenge its assumptions about captivity and freedom, strength and vulnerability, love and loss. The story of the thrall who refused to leave and the scarred warrior who learned to love again became part of the settlement's oral tradition, told and retold around winter fires for generations to come. It was a story about the power of human connection to transform even the darkest circumstances, about the courage required to choose hope over despair, and about the truth that sometimes the most profound journeys begin not with a destination in mind, but with the simple decision to keep moving forward. Sarah Gonzalez had come to the northern lands as a captive, but she left as something far more precious, a woman who had discovered her own strength and used it to build something beautiful from the ruins of what had been lost. Her story was proof that even in the harshest winters, spring would eventually come to those brave enough to endure and wise enough to recognize love when it appeared in unexpected forms. As their ship disappeared into the southern mists, the settlement's watchmen could see two figures standing together at the bow, facing whatever lay ahead with the confidence that comes from having survived the worst, and discovered that it was not, after all, the end of the story, but merely the beginning of something entirely new. The winter that had once seemed like an ending had become instead a transformation. And the woman who had been taken as a thrall had chosen to remain as something far more powerful, a partner, an equal, and a testament to the truth that the human heart, like the northern spring, cannot be conquered by even the longest darkness.